Today's daf, we're going to start 7 lines from the bottom on 24b, which is basically a discussion. Today's daf yomi is a discussion of a very important topic, which actually is a discussion throughout the Shas called Breira. Breira means choice. And the discussion is whether or not an uncertain event in the present can be determined by a future event, or whether a future event can help us understand what really happened in the past, or a present event can really help us really understand what really happened in the past. So in order to understand this question, actually, did I say we're going to start on the bottom of 24b, but really what we're going to do is start where we ended off this morning, and that is on 25a at 4 lines from the top. So we had discussed in the Gemara, 25a, 4 lines from the top of the page. The Gemara discussed that there were 4 cases in the Mishnah. The cases in the Mishnah of a person, the first case was a case of a person students who are writing a get and happened to be the same names, and the husband wanted to use this get to divorce his wife, and we said that's not acceptable. Second case was where this divorce bill, this get, was written by a man for his wife, and then he decides not to use it, and there's another man who has the same name, and the woman has the same name, and we say that's also not a valid document, and because it needs to be written with intent. And then the third case was the case of a man has 2 wives by the exact same name, and he writes the get for one wife, and now he wants to use it for the other wife, and that's also not acceptable. And the fourth case is the case where he says to the scribe, I have 2 wives by this name, write the get, and then later on I'll tell you which wife I want to use it for. Now the get has to be written specifically with this woman in mind. So he says, you write it, and then later on I'll tell you. And the Gemara says that's also not acceptable. The Mishnah says that's not acceptable. And the Gemara says, well, the author of our Mishnah says that Breira is not acceptable. Meaning to say, later on, he says to the scribe, write the get on Monday for my wife. And it could be, I'll tell you later on which Rachel I had in mind. And then on Tuesday, he says, well, I had in mind the older one. That's not acceptable, because later on, this later decision cannot help us determine which person the scribe had in mind. So our Mishnah does not say Breira. And then the Gemara then tells us that even though this get is not valid, there are 4 opinions in the Gemara amongst the later Amoraim. Even though it's not valid, does it have any validity whatsoever to be stringent and say that the woman is viewed as a divorcee, even though she still needs a valid divorce? And then Rabbi Yochanan says, actually, even that in none of those cases is the woman even need a divorce. She's completely, we view her as completely not divorced and not in any respect whatsoever. Must be that Rabbi Yochanan says we don't give any validity to this concept of Breira, that since at the time that he was writing the get, even in this last case for his wife, and since he didn't specify which wife he's writing it for, we don't view it as having any validity whatsoever. So it must be Rabbi Yochanan does not say Breira at all. And so the Gemara now on top of 25a, 5 lines from the top, the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan is consistent with his logic there. Rabbi Yochanan does not accept this concept of Breira. He does not say that a current event can tell us exactly what went on in the past. Let's say we have the following case. The Rabbi Yochanan taught brothers who divide up an estate. So the father didn't tell them which of you is getting which portion. The father has 2 fields. The father dies, and he leaves the fields to the 2 brothers, and one brother gets 1 field, the brother gets the other. But he didn't say, I'm dividing up my estate in this way. So we view these brothers as lekuchosein. We view these brothers as purchasing the fields from each other, rather than as an inheritance. If it would be an inheritance, then the brothers would retain the fields even in the Jubilee year. In the Jubilee year, all the fields go back to its original owners. But because they're purchasers, we don't view it as an inheritance. And therefore, we return it in the Jubilee year. If we would say Brera, we could say that now that they purchased the fields, we're viewing it retroactively that their father had bequeathed the fields to them through an inheritance. But because Rabbi Yochanan does not say Brera, we can't say that retroactively. It's clear going backwards, now that they've bought it from each other, it's clear that when he bequeathed it to them, he bequeathed each field to this specific brother. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan does not say Brera in that case, and he does not say Brera in the case of divorce. He doesn't say, well, now that he decides to divorce the older one, it's clear that when the scribe wrote the get, he had the older wife in mind. We don't say that. And now, says the Talmud, we need Rabbi Yochanan to teach us that he does not say Brera in both cases, both in the case of the divorce and both in the case of the brothers that purchased the fields. The Marbaha, because if you want to say that if we just said in the case of the divorcee, that he does not, in the case where he wants to divorce his wife, he just doesn't say which one at the outset, we would say, maybe only in that case of the divorce does Rabbi Yochanan say we don't say Brera, because Rabbi Yochanan says maybe by a get, the divorce needs to be specifically written for her in mind. But in the case of the purchasers, that there, maybe the Torah tells us that a sale will goes back. If you sold the land, it goes back in the Jubilee year. But if it's an inheritance or a gift, it doesn't go back in the Jubilee year. And so therefore, maybe in the case of the Jubilee year, it would actually be considered not a sale and it would be considered a gift, and he would get to keep it. And if you would just tell us the case of the field, then, and we'd say the field goes back in the Jubilee year, then I might have said Mishum Dul Chumra, that maybe we would put it back in the Jubilee year because we're just being strict. And since we're in doubt, we go for stringency. But to say that she is not disqualified by the get, that's actually leniency. We're allowing her to go back and be with her husband who's a Kohen. And so it was obvious that he says it specifically, we don't say Brera. Or Inami Kitchila, or else we would say that just like initially it was not divided to one person, so too in the Jubilee year. And it has nothing to do with Brera. We might say that the Jubilee year law has nothing to do with Brera. But in this case of the get, we might say we don't say Brera. We would say that we would say Brera, maybe in that case. So Tzricha. So therefore, we need Rabbi Yochanan teach us in both cases. So anyway, Rabbi Yochanan is saying, the Gemara says, we see from two instances that Rabbi Yochanan does not say Brera. So now the Gemara is going to take this up a next level. You following this, Hobbs?
Yeah.
So now the Gemara takes it up to the next level. By Minei Rav Hoshaya, mi Rav Yehuda. So Rav Hoshaya asked a question from Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda is an Amora, and Rav Hoshaya asked him a question. Let's say he says to the scribe, let's say the husband who's divorcing his wife, Amar L'Lablar, he says to the scribe, Kisova Ezo Sheteitze B'Pesach Tchila. He says, I have two wives behind that door. Both of them are named Rachel. I married two women with the same name. One of those Rachels is going to come through that door first. I want you to write the divorce for whichever Rachel will walk through that door first. So right now, have in mind, and when one of those women walks through that door first, it'll be clear that you had that woman in mind, that Rachel in mind. So what's the law there? Rav Shaya says to Rav Yehuda. So Rav Yehuda responds, Amarle, Tinisua. This is what our Mishnah taught us. Because didn't our Mishnah say, yes, isn't this the exact same case as our Mishnah? Because what does our Mishnah say? Yes, or Mikan, Amar L'Lablar. Yeah, more than this. If he said to the scribe, Ksova Ezo She'ertza Agarish, right? Ksova Ezo She'ertza Agarish, Pasul. Legarishbo. So isn't this the case of the Mishnah where he says, you write it for one of my wives, and then I'll use it for whichever one I want. And we say that that's not a valid divorce because we don't say brera. So isn't this the same case as the two women whichever woman walks through the door first? Alma ain brera. We see that we don't say brera. So our Mishnah says we don't say brera. So too in the case of whichever woman will walk through the door first, it shouldn't be a valid divorce. So that's what Rav Yehuda says to Rav Oshaya. This case of the two women walking through the door is the same case as our Mishnah, as whichever woman I'll decide to divorce will divorce. So Rav Oshaya challenges back Rav Yehuda, Eisvei. What about the following case? Excuse me, we have a case of a person we had this case in Pesachim. A man is going up to bring the Korban Pesach with his family. And as a general rule, you need to be registered in advance to bring the Korban Pesach. But this man, his children are giving him a hard time. They're not getting their act together. They're going slowly. And the father says, Omer Avanav, he says to the children, Hareini shochet es ha-Pesach, mi sheyala mikem rishon Yerushalayim. He says, I'm going to slaughter for the Pesach for whichever one of you gets there first. Kiven shenichnas rishon rosho v'rubo. Once the first person gets there, the first child gets there, zacha b'chalko, he gets two. He's the one who gets his portion. And he's allowed to bring his brothers alongside with him to bring the Korban Pesach. We see from here that this case of brera does work. This is a case where brera works because he says, I'm slaughtering the Pesach for all of you, and whichever one of you first, I'm slaughtering for the Pesach for whichever one of you gets there first. So after he slaughters the Pesach, subsequent to that, one of them gets there first, and then it becomes clear that he had that one in mind when he slaughtered the Pesach. And so we say brera in that case. So Rav Yehuda responds, Hoshaya, he says back to Rav Hoshaya, Hoshaya Bari, Hoshaya my son, he calls him my son. Gittin. This, you don't compare the laws of Pesach to the laws of a divorce. So didn't we learn about that case that Amar Rabbi Yochanan, that's not a real case of brera, because he wasn't being serious. The only reason why he said this was Kedela Zarzam b'mitzvos. The only reason why he was saying this was he wasn't really saying, I'm going to slaughter it forever, which one of you gets there first. I'm really having all of you in mind. He was just trying to get them to do the mitzvah quickly. Kedela Zarzam b'mitzvos. I'm allowed to encourage you in order to get you to do a mitzvah. I could say, get there first. It's the whole concept of zrizus, of doing the mitzvah as quickly as possible. That's why he was doing this. So that's the whole reason. It's not really a case of brera, and so he was just encouraging them to do the mitzvah quickly. And they could not. I mean, we could infer this. The katani, because actually the Mishnah says, "Kiven shenichnas rishon rosha v'rubo zacha b'chalko mazakas achavimo." And in fact, it's clear that this is what it means, because what does it state in the Mishnah? Once he gets there first. It says in the Mishnah that once he gets there first, he gets his portion, and he's also allowed to bring his brothers along. Now, if you want to say that he was registered from the beginning, makes sense. But if you want to say that the father didn't really register all of them, you're not allowed to register after the Paschal lamb was slaughtered. And that you can only change your registration until the Paschal lamb is slaughtered for you. But once it's slaughtered, you can't change it. And so we see from here that this is not a case of brera, because actually the truth is they were all registered from the beginning. And Tanya Namiachim, Maisa, Vikanmu, Banos, Abanim, Nimtu, Banos, Rizos, Ubanim Shafilim. And we haven't ever proof for this because there's a source, a brisa that says that one time they were doing this thing and the girls got there before the boys. The girls merited and the boys were low. But it doesn't say the boys couldn't bring the Paschal lamb. It's just that the boys were embarrassed. And so we see from here, this is not a case of brera, because in this case, the reason why they were all able to do it is not because we say brera, but just because everybody was registered in the end. So Amar Abaye says, I don't understand why Rav Yehuda responded like this to Rav Hoshaya. The two cases are not the same. Abaye says, what did Rav Hoshaya ask? He said, whichever one of these comes out first. So there, the husband says, I want you to write the get for whichever one of these women comes out first. That is what's called Tola B'das Acherim. That's an act that's dependent upon somebody else. Whichever woman comes out first. It's not dependent upon the husband at all. That's what Rav Oshaya is asking Rav Yehuda about. And how does Rav Yehuda respond? He responds, Tola B'das Atzmo. He responds by comparing it to the case of the Mishnah. He says, I want you to write the get, and I'll tell you later on which one I decide. You're comparing apples and oranges. He says he's asking me about something that's an act that's alien to the husband. And the husband is, and the Rav Yehuda responds by citing as a proof text the case of the Mishnah, which is an act that's dependent upon the husband's choice. They're two totally separate things. In the case where it's the husband's choice, we don't say brera, but maybe in the case which he asked about, maybe there, since it's not dependent upon him, it's dependent upon whichever woman was going to walk first. It's external. Maybe there we would say brera. So that's what Abaye says. Abaye says, he asks about a case where it comes from other people. Because he responds by something that's dependent upon himself. The other motive way, and then Rav Hoshaya responds again by saying something that then we challenge Rav Yehuda again from the case of Psachim, which is something that's again Torah b'das acherim, that's dependent upon other people. So Abai says, I don't understand this whole give and take. We're talking about two separate things, apples and oranges. One is it's dependent upon an external act, and one is dependent upon your own decision making. You by your own decision making, I can say we don't say brera, but when it's an external act, maybe we say brera in that case. Rava says, I don't understand. He says to Abai, I don't understand why this is bothering you. My kushya, why is this bothering you? Dilma demand the Islay brera. Maybe the person who says brera, i.e., like the case, whoever will say brera in general, he won't draw this distinction between whether or not it's dependent upon an external act or dependent upon your own decision making. He'll say he agrees with this concept. And the one who says, I don't say agree with this concept of brera, like the author of our Mishnah. Meaning to say, Rav is saying, why do you think that there's a distinction between whether or not it's Torah b'das acherim or Torah b'das atzma? Why do you think there's a distinction between it's dependent upon somebody else or dependent upon yourself? So Rav says to Abai, I don't understand why you're making this distinction. So Amoy Rav Masharsheh or Rava, Rav Masharsheh says to Rava, I'll tell you why. Because I have Tanoim, I have earlier authorities who we know distinguish brera, whether or not it's your own decision making or whether it's external to somebody else. How so? Rebbe Yehuda. This is not Rav Yehuda was the Amor, but Rebbe Yehuda, the Tana, in a case where it's Torah b'das atzma, in a case where it's dependent upon his own decision making, leisle brera. He won't say brera. But in a case where it's Torah b'das acherim, in a case where it's dependent upon others, Islay brera. He does say brera. How so? Torah b'das atzmo. How do I know in a case where it's dependent upon himself, he does not say the concept of brera? He'll be consistent with our Mishnah here, Islay brera. Tanya, I'll give you a case where it's dependent upon his own case, and he does not say brera. What's the case? Let's say somebody purchases wine from the kutim. So the wine from the kutim, you have to tithe wine when you buy from the kutim, because they presumably have not tithed it. And so therefore he assumes it wasn't tithed. So he needs to tithe it before he could drink it. He needs to take truma or meiser. But he can't, for some reason he can't tithe it. Either he doesn't have a vessel to pour it in, or maybe it's right before Shabbos, and he's not going to have time to separate it. And so what does this person say? So he says, Shnei Rugen Shani Asir Hafresh. He says 2 Rugen from this. There's 100 Rugen in the barrel. Truma is you have to take 1/50th. So he says the 2 Rugen that I'm going to eventually separate from here are in Truma. So he's saying brera. He's saying there's the whole. It's all liquid. It's all liquid in there. He's saying 1/50th of this liquid. 1/50th of this liquid is Truma. But he's not separating it yet. So the liquid that he's then going to drink, he's saying, I didn't drink the truma. I drank the other liquid. And then after Shabbos, he'll take out the 1/50th of liquid, and that's the truma. So that's breira. He says, what I'm going to separate on Shabbat, Saturday night, that was obviously not the truma. That was obviously the truma that I drank. And what I drank on Shabbos was not the truma. So breira, he's saying, when I separated, it shows that what I drank on Shabbos was not the truma. He says, and Asara, the 10 lugin in this thing, that's Meiser Rishon. That's a tithe for the Levite. And Tisha, the 9 after that, that's Meiser Sheni. He can just say, I'm designating it within it. And then the stuff I drink over Shabbos, that's not part of the tithe, the forbidden liquid. That's the other liquid. I'm not drinking that. Umecho on the top of 25b, and then it's okay to drink right away. Umecho v'shos miyad, and then the Meiser Sheni is okay. It's placed. Rashi says on any money in his house, and then he drinks it. That's the position of Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir clearly says breira in that case, because he says you can designate it, and then later on you'll take out the ones and say that was all you separated. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, they say osrin, and so they say it's not okay. So therefore, you see, since it's Torah b'das atzmo, there it's dependent upon his own opinion, because he's going to be the one to separate it. They don't allow breira. So that's what Rav Masharshi is saying, that in this case, Rabbi Yehuda is drawing this distinction. He's saying, since it's a case of Torah b'das atzmo, he doesn't allow breira. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon. Whereas if it's Torah b'das acherim, where if it's dependent upon other people, then islay breira. Then Rabbi Yehuda would say in a case of Torah b'das acherim, Rabbi Yehuda would say there is a case of breira. What's the case? The Tanan. What's the case where it's dependent upon others? And Rabbi Yehuda does say breira, because we say mahi ba'usan hayamim. The case here is where a man says to his wife, if I don't recover from this illness which I have right now, you are divorced. This is your get from right now if I die from this illness. So if he recovers, let's say he gives this to her in June. He says on June 1st, if I don't recover from this illness, he's very sick. If I don't recover, you're divorced from June 1st. And then comes along, he comes to September, and he dies in September. So we are going to say, under those circumstances, if he died from that same illness, she was divorced going back to June 1st. Why does she want to be divorced? Because then she doesn't fall to ever a marriage. She doesn't fall to Yibam to be with his brother. So he says, listen, you're divorced from right now. That's a case of Torah b'das acherim, because we're going to say under those circumstances, Rabbi Yehuda says, under those circumstances, Harei ke'eshes ish, called vareha. Then up until his death, she's like a married woman, and she can eat from his truma. And if she's adulterous, she gets punished. V'chimayis, but uchimayis have a gita. And then at the moment that he dies, then we're going to say that retroactively she was divorced from that moment, from that June 1st, because we're going to say retroactively that he really was divorcing her from that moment. And so therefore, since that's a case of Torah b'das acherim, because he doesn't control whether or not he dies, that's dependent upon God. And nevertheless, we're saying Rabbi Yehuda is saying breira. So we see from here that Rabbi Yehuda is saying that in the case of Torah b'das acherim, that we're going to say breira. And so that proves that Rabbi Yehuda makes this distinction. So then the Gemara says that Rav Masharsha comes along and says, not only is Rabbi Yehuda the one who draws a distinction between Torah b'das atzma and Torah b'das acherim, but he says, I'll give you another example of another Tana. Rabbi Shimon. This same Rabbi Shimon who agrees with Rabbi Yehuda that in a case where it's dependent upon the person himself, Torah b'das atzma, he does not say brira. I'll prove to you that Rabbi Shimon also does say brira in a case of Torah b'das acherim. Rabbi Shimon Torah b'das atzmo leis brira, but Torah b'das acherim. But in a case where it's dependent upon others, he does say breira. So how so? First of all, Tovadas Atzmo, Leisley Breira Hadamar. That's the same case of the wine barrel, where Rabbi Shimon was consistent with Rabbi Yehuda. But Tovadas Atzmo, Leisley Breira Hadamar. Tovadas Cherem. What's a case of where it's dependent upon an external factor? Rabbi Shimon does say Breira. Tanya, because we have the following case. Harenu bo alayech almanas sheyirtze abba. So let's say he says the man is going to have relations with the woman, and he says, I'm going to have relations with you, and it'll be for the purpose of marriage on the condition that your father will acquiesce to this marriage. So then we say, Afal pishalo ratza ha'av mikudeshes. The Tana Kama says, even if the father doesn't agree to it, we're still going to say it's a valid marriage, because it's logical to say that when he actually was having the relations with her, he changed his mind and he wanted to have because he doesn't, most people will not want their relations for just non-holy purposes, so they'd want it for the purposes. He changed his mind, his intent was for marriage. Whereas Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says, in the name of Rabbi Shimon, so now we're going to see this position of Rabbi Shimon, Ratza av mikudeshes. If the father actually decides that he approves of this marriage, then we're going to say that externally, that this is a tola b'das acherim, and we're going to say breira, and we're going to say it's a vow in marriage. Ratza av mikudeshes. Lo ratza av eno mikudeshes. But if the father does not want it, we're going to say it's not mikudeshes. And so therefore, we see from here that Rabbi Shimon also says, and where it's dependent upon somebody else, we do say breira, because if the father approves it, then retroactively we'll say that the bia, the relations, was for the purpose of marriage. So we see from here that both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon are both saying where it's dependent upon them themselves, Torah b'das atzma, we don't say breira, but where it's dependent upon others, we do say breira. So comes on Rava, and Rava says no. So Rava says, we're not going to say that. Rava says, Amar Rava says back to Rav Misharshia, Bein Rabbi Yehuda, Bein Rabbi Shimon, Lo shna tov b'das atzma, Lo shna b'tov b'das acherim, Islu breira. He says they both say breira. Actually, not only in the case where it's tov b'das acherim, not only in the case of the girl having the relations, the man having the relation on the condition that the father approves, there we say breira. Not only in the case of the man who gives the get on the condition that I die from this sickness, not only that case, but even in the case of the wine barrel, they both say breira. Well, if that's the case, why do they not allow him to separate the wine in this manner? If they say breira, they should be allowed to. Amar says, there is a specific reason. Hasam kedekatani taima. There is the reason, like we said in Erevin. Amru lo Rabbi Meir. They said to Rabbi Meir, you're saying when we separate it, that come tonight, we're going to separate the wine barrel and then we'll separate it out. But don't you know what's going to happen? The wine barrel is going to break. And then if the wine barrel breaks, he won't be able to have separated, because now you can't say, oh, the wine I drank was, he'll never have been able to separate it. And so he never separated the tithe. And so then retroactively we'll say that he never separated it. So, and so that he'll clearly have committed the sin, because he won't be able to separate under those circumstances. And so that it's not a concern about breira, it's a concern that you'll never be able to separate the wine in the end, because the wine barrel will break. And Rameir responds to him, he says, I'm not worried about the wine barrel breaking. Don't talk to me about the wine barrel breaking. Yeah, if the wine barrel breaks, we have a problem, but I don't have to worry about it. But anyway, Rava says that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon always say breira. So our Mishnah says we don't say breira, but Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon say we do say breira. And that's the thing. The thing to think about is breira is one concept in the Talmud, but it appears in many cases, and not all those cases are exactly the same. And God willing, we'll review this daf on Shabbos. We'll go into it. It's a beautiful, beautiful daf. We'll review it on Shabbos. Anybody have any questions? Able to